The key part of indigenous spirituality is forgiveness. The reality is that men and women are equal, they are the same, they share the gift of life and more. Only indoctrinated society thinks otherwise. But you have posts shared by Ben Shapiro. The problem is that you're living in a reality that doesn't exist, the way that it should be versus the way that it is. Men can be victims of women, but due to colonization enacting patriarchy, the victims of patriarchy are going to be predominantly women due to the systems that have been forced upon indigenous people and everyone else. It's still going to harm you as an indigenous man because you're indigenous, you're a minority group. Every minority group is going to be the victim of patriarchy because it's based on white men. But that doesn't mean that you're going to experience more harm for being a man. This is what you need to look into. It's called intersectional feminism. So it's the acknowledgement that when colonization happened or patriarchy was enacted in North America, yes, you're victimized as a minority group being indigenous, but the women were victimized more because the entire system was set up to benefit white men. It still harmed white women, but not to the extent of someone who's an indigenous woman, someone who is a black woman. Those groups are going to face more discrimination because they're not only the wrong color, they're also the wrong gender. What we actually saw in Canada, like when it comes to voting and who is considered a person, right? You weren't considered a person to be if you were indigenous. And when men went to war, women could vote on their behalf, right? So white women actually got the vote before indigenous people did. And the fact of the matter is, when we speak about statistics, it's not saying that like the stats were like 99% of crime is committed by men, right? It's not saying that men can never be victims because it's not discussing exactly who the victims are. It's saying that they're the perpetrators. But there's still the 1% that is women. But to say that the problem is not male violence is very disingenuous because 98% of most crime that is violent, that is harmful like that, is committed by men. You're able to acknowledge the fact that maybe you're targeted because you're an indigenous man. We have things like Starlight Tours. But what you're failing to acknowledge is that women are far more the target in this system than you are as a man. That's not to say that you can't ever be a victim or that you haven't been a victim. It's just statistically, women are going to be the victims far more frequently. That's why when we see in Canada, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, and I say it again, women, because women, regardless of their race, were viewed as property. When they came to North America, they switched how Indigenous people dealt with one another. That was what was enacted upon them in residential schools. But when you talk about Two-Spirit, I'm well aware of Two-Spirit. But when we're talking about people who would be considered Two-Spirit in the Indigenous community, those are trans people today. What we would talk about as trans people. In order to, there's like a way that the conversation needs to be framed in order to adequately address it for the majority of people viewing content to understand. So it's not to say that Two-Spirit don't exist. It's to say that when it comes to the Canadian system, when it comes to the Charter of Rights, when it comes to legal terminology, when it comes to all of these oppressive systems, they try to enact like male-female. We see it all the time. We see it in the United States right now. We see it with TERFs. We see it with transphobes. They try to enact men and women. But when having these conversations about the harms that are inflicted upon these groups of people, it has to be had in the context of the systems that exist, not the systems that should be there or that would still stand there. We can use the systems and explain how in Indigenous culture, this is how it was. When you're talking to people and they're transphobic, you can explain Two-Spirit. These people have been around for 40,000 years. People existed far before colonization happened. That's the context that you can use that in order to have conversations or defend or give context to people who don't understand, who are transphobes. But the reality of it is, up until, recent history, a man could grape his wife. It was not considered a crime. A man could put his hands on his wife. It was not considered a crime. So why is it so offensive to you to discuss the fact that that is still a lived reality for a lot of women? I've seen this with like a lot of when we're talking about marginalization, victimization. There's a lot of men within the marginalized group that want to pretend like the marginalization of women at a more extreme doesn't happen. But if you were to help break down the system that marginalizes women more, you would inherently benefit from that because it addresses the perpetrators, which are men who also harm you. And it's not to say that women are never perpetrators, but again, statistically, that is not what we see happening. That is because of patriarchy. When discussing these systems of Indigenous culture and it being around forgiveness, forgiveness does not mean no accountability. I can forgive someone for doing something. I can understand the context of why they did something. That does not mean that there's not consequences. And you see this in Indigenous culture before. They would excommunicate people. They would kick people out of their band, or back then they're like nations. Excommunication is something that happened. You can forgive the person for what they did while still holding them accountable and saying that they're harmful. Forgiveness is not the equivalent of enabling. And that's one thing that needs to be addressed, is like what you're asking for is more enabling, because you can't fight something that you can't describe, that you can't explain, that you can't point to, that you can't quantify. Not only that, but the forgiveness line of like no accountability, like where do you draw that line? You know, where do you draw the line on someone unalive someone? You can forgive them, but like it becomes toxic when we look at like church culture, right? Because that's how they forgave all the things that they did to Indigenous people. They just said, I'm sorry. That doesn't fix it. That doesn't help it. That doesn't do anything tangible.